If there's one thing the original Alien movie is about, it's divisiveness. People against people, people against robots, people against aliens, and people against their employers.
Before we dock, I think we ought to discuss the bonus situation.
Right.
Brett and I, we think we deserve full shares.
Alien Isolation, taking inspiration from the original film, attempted to express these conflicts systemically and ended up nailing it. The thing is, maybe it became a little too conflicted. See, Isolation was one of those rare titles where game reviewers really didn't agree on it, with some awarding it near perfect scores and others completely trashing it.
It's the new horror-themed Alien games that's been heralded as a hit by both Aliens fans and critics. Why?
The weirdest thing, however, is that this characterized my own feelings on it as well. About 30% of this game I found agonizingly tedious, but the remaining 70% is amazing. Despite the parts of it that didn't work for me, Alien Isolation is one of my favorite games of the past few years, and possibly ever. Because of this experience though, I'm absolutely fascinated with this game, though more as a designer than a player. My hunch has been that this is a deep-rooted problem regarding the xenomorph itself. My first time playing through the campaign, I noticed that whenever it was around, the game worked as intended, a strenuous experience of being prey, but that when it was absent during several long stretches in the campaign, the game devolved into frustration and annoyance. This isn't surprising given that the whole game was built around showing off this wondrous accomplishment of AI programming, but that doesn't really tell us what function the alien serves, or why the rest of the game relies upon it so much. For this video, we're going to look at the San Cristobal Medical section level, which is still pretty early in the game and gets in a couple of teaching moments. We'll take a look at why this level works so well while others later on don't, and how exactly one designs a level around a symbol of corporate disregard for well-being of its workers, emblematic of neoliberal capitalism as ushered in by the Reagan administration. The unknown. That's what everyone else says, right? Okay, so Alien Isolation is the first cross-platform game I'm covering, meaning it's on PC, Xbox One, and PS4, and Linux and Mac, but they have the same inputs as PCs. I'm going to default with these types of titles to talking about control mapping using a mouse and keyboard, since I'm sure more people are familiar with that setup, but of course if I talk about a game that's only on consoles, I'll use the appropriate controller. It's another first-person game though, so WASD to move the mouse to look around, hold shift to sprint, and use C to crouch, though why anyone wouldn't remap that to control is beyond me. Left mouse button uses whatever tool the player has equipped, whether that's a wrench, a device they've crafted, or a firearm, though the player needs to hold the right mouse button to aim. E is used to interact with objects in the world, whether that's save points, items you can pick up, or vent entrances. Pressing F toggles a player's flashlight, and Tab brings up the map screen. Holding Q brings up the player's inventory, which is a radial menu, and depending on what item they choose, they can press R to use or place it. On top of this is the crafting system, which I'm kinda ambivalent about. If the player clicks on one of the item slots, this brings up the crafting screen, provided it's a craftable item. From here, the screen will tell the player if they have enough of the right components, which are scattered around the levels, and if they do have enough, they can click on each component and the confirm button to make one instance of that item. Interestingly, the player can also use the arrow keys to navigate this screen and confirm things with the enter key, though annoyingly they still have to confirm everything with the mouse. The player can only craft items, however, after finding a blueprint for it in the game, though there's multiple blueprints for increasingly better versions of the same item over the course of the game. The player also receives some non-item tools over the course of the game that helps them unlock more and more paths. For instance, the security tuner can be used to hack open computerized doors by playing a minigame, more of which are added over the course of the campaign. The player similarly gets more tools and better versions of these tools as they progress. Because certain maps in the game are played through multiple times, the player will encounter certain blocked paths ahead of time. Informing them it requires a specific tool to unlock. Once the player comes back to these areas with their new tools, more paths are available to them, and given that the game increases in difficulty over time, these paths are necessary. The most important item the player has, however, is the motion scanner. Holding spacebar to bring it up, the player can use it to locate moving enemies, indicated by those green dots on its screen. You'll notice, however, that it's kind of vague. It gives the player a direction relative to them where the enemy is, and a general sense of how far away it is. But the tuner doesn't draw the layout of the current level over it, doesn't tell you exactly how far these enemies are, and most importantly, doesn't tell you what type of enemy it is. Keep this in mind, this is going to be important later. Something that was frequently touched on in the discussion of the game was the use of save points. The player needs to save their progress at specific locations in the game, which is not uncommon at all, but isolation adds an interesting wrinkle by making the player wait several seconds after using the save point before the save menu actually appears. This doesn't pause the game around them though, meaning it's entirely possible for the player to be killed while waiting for it to show up. Hint text will even appear when enemies are nearby, letting the player know that saving progress isn't a sure thing and is a decision that needs to be actively weighed. Another thing the player is going to see in the environment are rewire panels. Opening these allows the player to switch certain powered systems in the game on and off, like cameras and lights, by allocating units of power between them, and that's about it. Like, this seems like something that could be an interesting basis for a puzzle, but the only thing I ever used it for was to shut off security cameras, and in instances where the player is forced to use them as part of a mission. One of the more frequent things the player is going to encounter are QuickTime events, or QTEs. This comes up as the player uses a wrench to open a door, activates an emergency power system, or uses a blowtorch to open a panel. I'm not the biggest fan of QuickTime events, but these are at least somewhat active and they do serve a purpose. What is that purpose? Well, given that this is a horror game, we should probably first talk about your brain.
That's right, Kevin. Yours specifically.
Psychology is a very relevant field that game design pulls from, and not just to wear you down into purchasing those loot boxes at the expense of being unable to pay for groceries so some investors can get more wealthy. Specifically, the branch of cognitive psychology deals with how we process sensory information, think about things, and solve problems. In short, it's about how we think, and given that most games are just a series of problems for us to solve, it's a very handy thing to know. A couple of concepts most people are familiar with are long-term and short-term memory. Long-term memory is stuff that stays with you for years, like the names of friends and family, and the fact that your cognitive psychology class in college was at 8 AM and you feel like you would have learned more if that wasn't the case. Short-term memory is stuff that's more recent before either moving into long-term memory or being forgotten, and is believed to last around 30 minutes or so. Like when you're introduced to a new person and you're trying to recall their name for the first time. There's a third type though, working memory, which is shorter than short-term memory, which in retrospect makes short-term memory kind of a dumb name. Thanks, psychology. Working memory refers to what's currently in your head at any particular time, which is most often information relating to a problem you're trying to solve, like different values in a math problem. Working memory allows this information to be manipulated in certain ways, such as mathematical operations like adding or multiplying, which is something short-term memory can't do. Related to this concept is cognitive load, which just refers to how much information a person has in their working memory at any given time. Generally speaking, the higher a person's cognitive load, the more stressed they are. Typically, game designers try to minimize this because they don't want to create an overly stressful game, and a good example of this are the improvements made between the Portal games. In the first game, the player could place portals onto a wall, but as soon as they went around a corner, they couldn't see where that portal was, requiring the player to remember where they placed it. Portal 2, however, added these screen space indicators that showed up when this situation occurred, allowing the player to forget where the portals were and freeing up some of their working memory so the designers could create more complex puzzles. Note, though, that this stress is not tension, at least not exactly. So what is tension? I mean, come on, it's tension. It's a feeling, man. Come on, it's ridiculous. It's not like it's some paper or study that exactly defines what it is. I mean, in their paper, Toward a General Psychological Model of Tension and Suspense, Moritz Lenn and Stefan Kolsch pull from a number of other studies and define tension as a result from a person making predictions about a situation but having insufficient information to come to a definitive conclusion, and create this diagram to illustrate this. Tension occurs between the best case and worst case scenarios the information they have implies, and the more disparate those cases are, the more tense the experience. Take Counter-Strike for instance. If playing on the CT team, the player will either need to kill all the players on the opposing team or wait for them to plant the charge they have, then clear the area and defuse it, which takes time. In this situation, the best and worst cases are pretty apparent, winning and losing, centered around the question, will the charge go off? If the opposing team plants the package, but there's only one left, versus 4 players on the player's team, victory is way more likely, and so the situation isn't all that suspenseful. If the package is placed and it's 1v1 though, that's way more tense, as both success and failure are equally likely. If the player clears out all opponents but the charge is 3 seconds from detonating, then the tension is also removed, as the outcome of loss is also known, leaving the player with a couple of moments of a resigned disposition of, shit, I guess we lost this one. Note though that a person needs to have enough information to start with in order to make predictions with in the first place. Putting a player in a horror game and then just having a monster jump out to scare them doesn't create tension unless their presence is implied beforehand. Creating tension then is a balancing act of making sure the player knows enough to start to try and figure things out, but not enough to make the answer readily apparent. So when Creative Assembly set out to make this game, it was apparent that everyone and their dog had tried to make a game based around aliens, but games based around the original movie were far less frequent. As such, the studio tried to focus on that, and was faced with the question of what a simulation of being a crew member on the Nostromo would be like. Well, the experience seems really damn stressful, and pretty tense too. So how did Creative Assembly recreate that? So one thing that becomes more apparent as you enter the industry is that you need to get very specific as to where you want to end up. For instance, I'm a level designer, sure, but I'm trying to be a level designer for horror and immersive sim games.
Which is why I talked about the Looking Glass games first on this channel.
But if I wanted to apply for a level designer position for a studio making JRPGs, I'm probably not going to get a call back, although they will call me Jared-san. And if you're familiar with Creative Assembly's previous output, you'll know it's mostly top-down strategy games, which is nowhere remotely close to first-person horror. The company actually had to hire people from outside to help. But what thing would a strategy game company have an advantage with that they could utilize when tackling a completely different genre? AI. It doesn't take a lot to realize that AI opponents in strategy games are really sophisticated. Like, you have to have multiple units that are trying to coordinate towards specific objectives, and they need to respond to the player's actions accordingly, and they need to work at different levels of effectiveness depending on the difficulty setting, and oh my god. Creative Assembly, knowing their strengths, created an alien game around making the most convincing AI of an alien as possible. Despite polarized reception to the game as a whole, almost everyone agreed on one thing. This is pretty good AI, eh? I'm taking most of this from Tommy Thompson over at AI in Games, who made an excellent video on this game, and if you want a more thorough rundown of how this works, definitely check it out. When designing how the xenomorph would behave, the team came up with a few rules that they wanted the enemy to follow, the most profound of which being referred to at Creative Assembly as psychopathic serendipity, meaning the alien will find itself in the right place at the right time. To accomplish this, the AI is actually split into 2 entities, the xenomorph itself and an invisible entity called the AI Director. Each level is split into large chunks, though if they're automatically calculated or hand-placed by designers, I don't know. When the player is in one of these chunks, the AI Director every minute or two points the alien to the one the player is located in, meaning that it's almost always in the player's vicinity, and if not, it will be the next time the director prods it. Of course, if the alien's in the same room and continually attempts to sniff the player out, then the player's not going to have much of an opportunity to sneak around it. This is especially important because if the player is spotted by the alien, it charges at them and kills them in one hit. Because fighting or fending off the xenomorph isn't an option, at least until fire-based tools are acquired later, the emphasis is placed on the player's skills to avoid and evade being perceived, but the alien needs to be looking the other way or a ways away for that to be a fair challenge. As such, the AI director actually keeps the alien on a timer and every so often tells it to back off from the player and search elsewhere in the level. This has an interesting effect on pacing. If you recall in my What is Level Design video, I talked briefly about pacing and level design being related to difficulty over time and how it typically follows the standard interest curve. If you didn't watch that video, well, let's be honest, no one did. But I talked about games being able to have their pacing differ from the interest curve and deliberately used footage of alien isolation there. To borrow from Chris Franklin of Errant Signal, isolation on a scale from 0 to 100 pretty consistently maintains a 70 or 80 most of the time. And as it turns out, that matches up pretty well with what the AI systems are trying to do. When the alien is actively searching the room the player's in, that's about an 80 when the game is at its most intense. But when the AI director tells it to back off, that's about a 70 because it's still in the same vicinity. And after some time, if the player doesn't move very far, the alien comes back in, bringing it up to an 80 again. If the player manages to get to a new chunk of the level though, that will put some distance between them and the alien, allowing them to relax a bit at about a 50 until the AI director tells it to move closer to the player. Graphing this out, you get this periodic pattern which is pretty constant, with intermittent moments of relative respite. This isn't to say that the whole game will fluctuate between a 50 and an 80 in difficulty over its whole length, but that this pattern of constant pressure with small dips every so often is what the game is aiming for. What's interesting is how this interlocks with that cognitive model of tension we looked at earlier. If the difficulty of isolation is inversely related to the distance between the player and the alien, meaning the closer they are the more difficult the game is, and tension is the failure to predict whether or not the best or worst case answer to a question is likeliest, then that question the player is asking themselves, can the alien detect me while I'm here, is harder to answer the closer it is. Because of the way the systems encourage the xenomorph to be in close proximity, they're not just creating a difficult experience, they're creating a tense one as well. Even using the motion scanner contributes to this. Like mentioned previously, it'll communicate that something's moving, but not what exactly, and only gives you a rough distance. Through the use of this tool, the player is attempting to answer the question, where is the alien, and only receives information that an enemy is vaguely in this direction relative to them, leaving them with not enough information to make predictions, and therefore serving as another source of tension. What makes the experience even more suspenseful is the way the xenomorph learns. Well, it doesn't exactly, but it's intended to appear that way. Again, according to Thompson, at specific points in the campaign, certain behaviors for the alien are unlocked, allowing it to use them as part of its behavior tree, which is a concept I'm not getting into here. Watch AI in games. I'm serious. What's interesting though is that the xenomorph can also pick up certain behaviors in response to the player's actions. For instance, the player can take cover under certain objects by crouching and moving towards them like a desk or a gurney, or hide in lockers Outlast style. During one of the times I was replaying segments of the game in preparation for this video, the alien actually started getting down on all fours and looking under objects to search for me, and sniffing in front of lockers I was in. It had never done this so early in the game for me, so I can only imagine the AI director was keeping track of the number of times I hid and prodded the xenomorph to start searching for me in response to that. Even though the alien is the most prominent enemy in the game, others are present as well. You've got fellow humans, with some of them being friendly and others being hostile, and the game not telling you that sometimes, and the Worker Joes, which are cheap mass-produced knockoffs of the androids that Weyland-Yutani makes. Hostile humans are quite frequently armed, while androids speedwalk towards the player and try to strangle them if they catch up. What's interesting, however, is the ways in which they interact. Naturally, the xenomorph will attack other humans. However, it pays no mind to robots, so if the player's angered a bunch of Worker Joes while the alien's about, that means they'll need to deal with both threats simultaneously. While if there's people around, the player can deliberately lead them into a conflict with the alien and undercut decades of collective bargaining and worker solidarity. Sorry, I'm getting worked up again. Something to keep in mind though is the player actually needs to be able to tell what behavior the alien is engaging in at any given time. This has actually been pretty well documented in certain cases. A game's AI can be as smart as it wants, but if the player doesn't understand what it's doing at any given time, it's perceived as being unfair and cheap. I actually had a professor who once worked on a Rainbow Six game where he talked about this problem, although I can't remember which one, unfortunately. Playing through Isolation my first time, though, I was able to notice specific sound effects and learn to distinguish what behaviors they were associated with. Obviously, you can tell if it's patrolling because of its footsteps, as well as its hiss if it thinks it saw you, and the squeal it makes when it knows it saw you. But I was also able to discern between when the alien went into a vent and when it came out of one, meaning players have some information about its state even when they can't see it. And the player is going to need to rely on sound a lot, because quite frequently they're going to be hiding under tables and lockers and inside vents. I noticed on this last playthrough though that the motion scanner doesn't seem to work as well in vents, as well as it being partially obscured while hiding in a locker. While the scanner doesn't give the player a lot of information on the alien, it's still their best source while remaining at a more comfortable distance. So while the player may need to hide every so often, this seems to be a subtle push to keep them out in the open and on the move. Slowly, that is, as sprinting serves as a source of sound that can attract the xenomorph, as well as other hostiles in the area. This is actually pretty consistent with other sources of sound, including noisemakers the player can craft, hitting something with a wrench, and engaging in firefights with human enemies, which can cause the alien to fight them. This is sounding pretty familiar. Similarly, the alien is consistently threatened by sources of fire, including flamethrowers and molotovs the player can make, which can also be used against... No. It couldn't be. Lastly, the QTEs in hacking minigames. In any other game, these would be kind of filler, but in Isolation, they're also kind of filler, but with a purpose. See, if you notice, engaging in these QTEs, hacking a door, or even opening the inventory and crafting screen doesn't pause the game, meaning that the alien is still hunting for the player. This is a pretty big risk, as the player is stuck in place while they engage in any of these activities, leaving them visible and vulnerable for a few seconds. Again, this is a source of tension, as the question of, do I have enough time to open this door, is largely dependent on the vague values of how long it takes for the player to complete the task, as well as how far away the alien is during that time. But also, if your short-term memory is working, you'll remember what we talked about regarding working memory. And if you're already familiar with the concept of working memory, well, that was kind of a douchey thing to say on my part, so I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry. The hacking games are better at evoking this, but they require the player to solve a basic problem, usually under time pressure, to open the path that they want to. However, because the game doesn't stop around them, the player also needs to keep track of where the alien is and what it's doing, largely relying on those audio cues to interpret what its behavior is at that moment. By requiring them to keep track of two things at once, the game forces the player to keep more information in their working memory, creating not just tension, but a stressful experience as well. So that's how Alien Isolation simulates the experience of the first Alien movie, at least through its systems. The player is constantly pushed into a position of moving slowly and persistently, all the while needing to keep track of the alien's position at all times, no matter what they do. Unless you open the map screen, then it pauses the game. I don't get it either. I'm taking a look at San Cristobal Medical Center because it's really the first full level where you have an extended one-on-one experience with the xenomorph. Up to this point, the players learned a number of basics, including the mechanics and engaging in stealth around hostile humans and worker Joes, and they've also obtained some items like the wrench, the security tuner, and a revolver. The alien itself doesn't get introduced until about an hour and a half in. It comes after a couple of tutorial maps that are really railroaded and frustrating, and honestly, they made me almost give up on the game entirely. But I'm really glad I didn't, because once the alien's introduced, the game immediately gets so much better. The level where it's introduced requires the player to sneak around some people firing at them, then go down to a lower level to obtain the security tuner, where the xenomorph first makes itself seen. The way it's introduced actually cleverly communicates several aspects about it, that it can come down from ceiling vents, what it sounds like when it's walking around, and that it can open motion-activated doors. After making their way back up, the player is also taught that the alien will attack other humans, killing the ones they had to circumnavigate a few minutes ago. Given the line of sight of the player's re-entry point though, a lot of this is communicated orally, disturbingly and effectively leaving a lot of it to the player's imagination. But for the next mission or so, requiring the player to sneak into the communications area, the alien seems mostly absent despite it making quite a ruckus. It's present in a couple of areas, sure, but it's entirely possible to go through this mission without truly coming face to face with it once, San Cristobal being the first area where the player is forced to engage with it. Oh right, there's a reason you're going there. So the player, playing as Amanda, the daughter of Ripley from the movies, boarded a space station to obtain a recording, but there was an explosion that separated Amanda from her colleagues. At this point, the player is reunited with them, but Samuels, the android, informs them that Taylor, their colleague, is pretty hurt, so they're tasked with finding some medical supplies, which forms the narrative arc for the next few missions. So the player goes up the stairs and into this lobby and hears someone communicating to them through an intercom, hurriedly urging them to get in the elevator and meet them, taking the player to the next level. After the loading screen, the voice tells the player that, rather than using the very brightly lit door there, which is locked, to use a vent in the room to the left to get to him. Going through, the player drops down into this T-junction and moves ahead past this reception area towards a save point. Walking into this waiting room, the player meets Dr. Coleman on the other side of this window. He tells the player that the medical supplies they need to retrieve are downstairs, but the code and the keycard needed to get there are with Dr. Morley, who he last saw on this floor. Coleman then tells the player to go get them, giving the excuse that he can't because,
Do I look like I'm in any fit state?
Yes. Am I missing something? Anyways, the player heads to the right to open this door by hitting a pretty poorly lit button. Going forward around to the left brings the player to this corner of the first main area. The initial read here is kind of cluttered. These lights are kind of distracting, and this obstacle blocks the player from seeing a side hallway that branches off of here. This area kind of serves as a hub, with the main hallway forming a torus around the central room here, and a number of small halls and rooms branching off. On the far end from the entrance is a locked door that requires a code, which we'll get to soon. Heading down the left hall from the entrance, the player passes a door to that central room with another save point inside. Going further in this direction, the player hears Coleman prompt them that they're near Morley's office. Going down the stairs and hacking this door open gives the player access, and rummaging through the computer there reveals the security code 1702. On finding it, Coleman reminds the player that the keycard is also needed, but that it was always on Morley's person, so they're going to need to track him down. And then the alarms go off. On edge, the player moves back towards that hub area to use the code on that locked door, but as soon as they go back up those stairs...
Do I look like I'm in any fit state?
You fucking prick. Fortunately, there's a gurney right there helping block the sightline, and the player can hide under it as well if they want. The xenomorph mostly moves around the circular hallway and through the center room, the windows between them not helping the player stay hidden. That hallway that was blocked from the initial read leads to a dead-end room. On the other side, there's also a room that can be unlocked with the code the player just received, though it leads back to the bottom of the stairs where they just were, so it's not very helpful. When the player gets to the other end and has enough time to enter the code, the door opens to another hallway, which is not exactly the most relieving thing to see when standing out in the open. There's an office to the left that quickly terminates, and to the right is another circular hallway with a couple of spoke rooms leading to this living area for the medical staff. A blueprint for a noisemaker is located here as well, which is pretty handy. However, if the player moved directly ahead from the passcode door, they'd end up there anyways, with the hall to the next segment immediately to the left, so the player might not engage with that hallway at all. Entering this bunk bed area, the player sees this dry erase board with Morley's last assigned rooms written on them, which they'll need to remember. Going back into the hall, the player heads down towards the new section. On the right is a research room that has another save point, though this area is a dead end as well. The hall bends around to the left, leading to the door to the examination rooms on the right, though the player can also enter this vent and end up in this supply room to minimize the amount of time they spend out in the open. Entering here, the players met with an octagonal hallway, with exam rooms serving as spokes facing inward, overlooking a central area below. Each one has a sign indicating its number, so the player needs to recall which ones were on that dry erase board,
Although it's always in room A29, don't bother.
While the alien patrols around the hall outside, the player can sneak into the room across from where the keycard is and hack the door in the opposite wall from this side, opening to the hall right next to where that save point was, giving the player a new path to make backtracking through the level a bit easier. Or if they're more observant than me the first dozen times I played this map, they can go through this door that connects back to where they dropped out of the vent in the beginning and use the keycard to open it. Yeah, that'd be a lot easier. So from here, the player makes their way back to Cullman and understandably gets pissed, but he enters the code to unlock the elevator and gets rightfully murked by the xenomorph. The player then runs to the elevator down and uses the keycard to get it moving, ending the level? How far into the video are we? Wow, we are really under time. So do we just like hang out here? Let's keep going. After the loading screen, the elevator opens with a save point fortunately right outside. 3 rooms branch off this L-shaped hall, and a vent opposite those doors says it won't open because it's not powered. The outer 2 doors are locked as well, though there's something jamming the center one. Yanking it out, the player obtains a stun baton, which will come in handy against human and android enemies. The door becomes unstuck, allowing the player to enter. The puzzle to open the vent isn't terribly engaging, to be honest. The player reads the files on the computer in the room to find out power fluctuations can be dealt with by adjusting the coolant system, from an email sent by someone named Dr. Lingard. The player can see through a window that a rewire panel is in the next room. Engaging both coolant cylinders on one side unlocks the door to the room, but one's missing to unlock the rewire room. The player opens the other room to get a spare cylinder so that they can open the other and power the vent. I mean, it works, I guess. Going through the vent, the player drops into some more living quarters in the center of another ring-shaped structure and is told to check out Lingard's office for information about where some supplies might be located. Fortunately, that's just around the corner to the left, and using the computer, the player is told some supplies are in the nearby operating theater. The player can also watch a video Lingard recorded, which is pretty effective, but it's the only time a pre-rendered cutscene plays from using a computer, which makes it this kind of weird anomaly. Looking at their map, the player notices the quickest way to the next objective is to exit this office and head right. Doing so, however... Fuck! And because of this, the alien appears on the other side and sees the player, but it runs around the long way. I guess it doesn't like fire. So the player's going to have to hide from it for a bit, then go the long way around while it's incensed. There's a segment ahead where this room splits off from the central hall, and a second hall runs concurrent for about a quarter rotation, creating this 2-lane structure that the player can alternate paths in. That merges eventually, right before the room where the player needs to go next is. Unsurprisingly, the door to the next segment is locked, but there's an office right next to there with a save point inside. Looking at the computer gives the player a code to the display case where the keycard is, and on the desk is a blueprint for Molotovs. Wow, if I didn't know any better, I'd say that wasn't a coincidence. Unlocking the door, the player finds himself in the middle of this long hallway that bends away from them eventually on either side. The most direct path to the operating theater, however, is ahead and a bit to the left. Heading down this perpendicular hall, the player enters the last door on the left to enter the operating theater and finds the trauma kit on the bed. Finally, let's get the hell out of here. The exit from this area is to the south? I don't think there's a south in space. The player can head back to that last locked door, but head the other way, going around the corner to the left. From this view, though, the player can see some people up ahead, and they don't sound like they're the friendliest folk. There's a couple gurneys in the middle of the hall where the player can hide under, but they'll need to make their way forward and to the right, either through this side room or at the intersection of the hallway. It's also pretty likely that the alien will show up and clear some of these people out. Going down this short hallway though, the player finds out the door is busted. Samuels informs them that there has to be a way to evacuate the area, so the player is prompted to go to the generator room to initiate evacuation procedures. The player can either backtrack to the operating theater from here, then go out the door on the other end and head right, or from the broken door they can head right at this T-junction and head through this large open room, though hostile people might still be around depending on what the AI decided to do. There's another save point once the player gets there, fortunately, though the door locks behind them. There's a computer in the middle of the room, but it's unpowered, but cables lead the player's eye to two crank generators. Simply mash E to power one up, then go across the room to power the other one up, then just head down to the... jeez. So the player needs to sneak down and hack the computer while avoiding the working Joe, and the possible alien drooling out of these vents certainly doesn't help. Once hacked, the door to the outside reopens if the player wants to risk the android following them, but they can also lose them by entering this floor vent, which was previously unopenable because it was unpowered. Either way, the player ends up in the four-way intersection outside, only to find the door to that more direct route to the exit is locked, meaning the player is, again, going to have to go the long way around. Going down that hall, the alien really seems to like hanging out in these vents right now, and towards the far end at the corner are some more hostile people. The player can cut through the operating theater or the room next to it, and head back down this hall to the exit. On the other end, though, is the area the rooms from the previous level were overlooking, which, well, I thought it was neat. A scripted sequence plays where the alien shows up, but a bunch of explosive traps go off, knocking the player out. When they wake up and find out they're alive for some reason, the xenomorph's gone, but the fire around them is slowly hurting them. The player then jumps onto this ladder, engaging in a bunch of QTEs, but without the pressure of the alien around they feel kinda limp. The fire damaging the player is supposed to replace that, but it takes a whole minute or two to kill them, so the whole thing feels like an Uncharted sequence where the player's in faux danger. Eventually, the player makes it to a vent above, then drops down into a hall. Right next to there is an elevator that takes the player to the next level, Seegson Synthetics, and after that level, the player eventually makes it back to their colleagues with the trauma kit, which means that, yes, it takes the player 3 levels to get a med kit. Taylor's no pushover, I'll tell you that. So if I didn't say it enough times while walking through the levels to the point where it got grating, the shape of most environments in Alien Isolation are heavily centered around ring or torus-like layouts. Given that it's a stealth game, it's hardly surprising that it has some features similar to the maps in Thief, though given the advancement in technology, maybe a little less rectangular. This shape makes a lot of sense for stealth because its gameplay is based around enemies and their line of sight. Long hallways on each side are places the enemy can look down and spot the player, but the hollow center blocking the rest of the space provides the player with a lot of unobserved area to hide out in. Unlike Thief, though, whose layouts are often a densely interconnected mesh of these, isolations are more directed. Often one area is blocked off from the next via a single choke point, typically a locked door, but these individual rings, almost arena-like areas, help to prevent the levels from feeling suffocatingly linear. This structure is often referred to as a string of pearls, providing segments where the player can move around and do what they like, but the entrances and exits to each are in very specific areas, allowing the designer to control the exact order. We see this in the first half of San Cristobal, with this ring area where the alien first drops in being separated by that locked door, then this loop that forms the medical staff's living quarters, though there's no obstacle delaying the player from entering the next area, and the circular hall that all the examination rooms branch off of. This mostly carries over into the second half of the level past the elevator as well. Though the morgue is basically a hallway with 3 rooms attached, the area where the player is introduced to fire forms a circle as well, with that larger area finishing up the level forming a lopsided figure 8. The spokes off these wheel-shaped locations are often just single rooms, forming short dead ends. Obviously, having a couple places to hide in each is a good idea, as the player is likely to be hiding in these areas because they feel uncomfortable with the alien's proximity or they're just trying to duck out of its line of sight. But because the alien tends to get really up close to the player and then back off a bit in this oscillating fashion, these tend to be areas where a backed into a corner experience is the focus and proves to be intense. Because again, tension is when your audience can't predict whether the best or worst case scenario is going to occur, and the xenomorph is a walking worst case scenario. But if you take it away, what's left? So, breaking the fourth wall here, kinda, I rate these scripts in order, and by going through the systems and mechanics and then applying my findings there to the level I want to look at, I usually have a moment where everything sort of clicks, and I feel like I have something worth writing about in the philosophy section by the time I get there. So, when I wrote my feelings about how isolation doesn't work when the alien is absent, that was the opinion of me a few weeks ago. And looking at the game more critically, my opinion has evolved a bit. There's aspects that I still largely agree with though. Namely, because the alien can kill the player in one hit, having it notice and attack them is the worst outcome. In segments of the game where it's not a threat though, the worst case is being killed by human or android enemies, which take a couple of tries each. Similarly, the behavior of these enemy types are pretty basic. Most of the time when alerted, humans tend to stay behind cover and fire at the player, whereas Worker Joes speedwalk towards the player. Similarly, if the player gets out of a certain radius of these enemies, they tend to revert to a less aggressive state, reverting to their previous patrol path or just wandering around. Running away, of course, isn't an option with the alien because it's faster than the player, and running will create sound that alerts it anyways. And as we mentioned before, the AI director will keep pointing it towards the player's location, so getting out of range isn't an option either. So when the player needs to run away from other enemy types, there's a risk-reward aspect to sprinting when the alien's around. Don't run around recklessly or else the alien will find you. But when the alien's out of the picture, that just becomes don't run around recklessly or...
I'm gonna do this. Or what, you're gonna kill me? Or what, you're gonna kill my family?
I'm just gonna do this.
Okay.
When the potential punishment for this action is removed, or at least replaced with something less effective, then why shouldn't the player run past all potential confrontations, or, even worse, just duck into a vent where those enemies can't pursue them? The one level I'm keeping in mind while saying all of this is Solomon's Galleria, which is basically a space mall. This level comes right after the alien is temporarily removed as a factor in the game. I'm trying to remain spoiler free here. I'm not going to walk through this whole map here, but there's a number of small things I'd like to point out that make the experience less enjoyable. First off, just looking at the layout, you'll notice that it's less constructed around ring-shaped environments. Obviously there's some intent behind this, as the shape more resembles ripples emanating from a central point here. But because of this, the space is less interconnected. This results in a number of weird dead ends, which are longer and more pronounced than those single-room spokes we talked about earlier. Additionally, the critical path through the level is way more constrained and linear, with a lot of enemy encounters occurring in plain old straight hallways, providing no opportunity for the player to engage in stealth. One of the issues that keeps popping up as well is lighting, and the doors in this level are a perfect example of the problem. As I've talked about in previous videos, lighting an area can help serve several purposes, including help communicate 3D space, as well as highlighting important areas or objects. So there's a number of doors in Solomon's Galleria that are locked, and others provide a way forward for the player. How do you communicate which ones are the correct ones to approach, and which ones the player can ignore? Ideally, you'd use certain meshes to communicate which doors can be opened and which ones can't, but if your artists can't, or won't, spend time to model a dozen different doors, it's faster and easier to just light the ones you want players to approach and leave others in the dark. So, near the center of this map is the first set of these shutters the player encounters, and, wouldn't you know it, the one that's lit is the only one the player can open. If you go up to the second floor though, this door with the same mesh is also lit and can be opened. And this one just down the hall is also lit and... nothing. And what makes matters worse is this completely darkened one on the floor below, which the player needs to go through to reach an objective. Unfortunately, this is a problem that's kind of present throughout the whole game. If you've seen Mark Brown's video on the Uncharted games, you know that game developers typically reserve a particular color in a color palette to highlight important objects. In the case of Naughty Dog, it's typically white or yellow to indicate ledges that can be climbed on. Alien Isolation does this with two colors, neon green to indicate objects in the environment that can be interacted with, and neon orange for an outline shader on items the player can pick up. Similar color choices are made with lighting, with contrasting colors typically used for lights to indicate important things, which Isolation does with a soft yellow-orange hue. Problem is, if you want to put an important item there that the player needs to pick up, its orangey shader is probably going to have a hard time standing out from the orangey illumination. All of these admittedly very small issues combine in Solomon's Galleria to create a level that people seem to get lost in, myself included.
So what the hell am I supposed to do? That locked off there? This just goes back the way I came? There's no vents over here? It's like I'm awfully confused as to exactly what you want from me, game!
Huh. Now what do I do? Huh.
Without clear direction on where to go, and where the player can just run around enemies instead of actually being forced to sneak around them. But, as I said before, I'm more convinced now that non-alien enemies can work without the alien around, and I think this because isolation does make them work in certain other situations. For instance, there's a short mission where the player needs to reactivate some transportation in the space station, and it's basically constricted to this room. The player enters and hears a banging behind a locked door, communicating a droid is behind there. They activate a console and a hostile human comes in, which the player can fight or sneak around. On activating another console, the door is unlocked, releasing the worker Joe, which kills the human enemy if they're still there. The player then needs to reactivate the console in the center room, making it likely that they'll alert the android. In order to get out though, they need to get into the closet where the droid just was, but because the area is so small, the player can't run out of their area of awareness, and if they just run into where the important item they need is, they'll be cornered by the working Joe. Because of this, the player is forced to deal with the enemy before going in. The situation's a lot less tense when the player can just run away from enemies, so one solution is to just take away their ability to run away. This also plays out pretty well with a big fight in the back half of the game where the player takes on like 8 droids simultaneously. Because the conflict is restricted to 2 rooms, running and hiding isn't an option, keeping the pressure high. Conversely though, the xenomorph wouldn't work in these small areas because that motherfucker needs room. Which is why we sent it to a farm upstate. You know, with your childhood pet. But the thing I want to emphasize is that these are fairly minor problems when looking at the game as a whole, even if they do have a big impact on the player's experience. As I'm seeing firsthand, anyone who's able to pay the bills while working as a game developer is working their ass off, the people at Creative Assembly especially. So there's a couple systems I'd change, and a couple levels are kinda clunky, big deal. What eventually got shipped is still really damn impressive, and even though the level designers do have some say over the systems, I can't guarantee, had I been in the midst of developing this with the people who worked on this game, that these problems would have occurred to me either. Also, I would have been like 17 at the time. They're not hiring a 17-year-old. But given that this is a channel focusing on level design, let's assume we have to make do with the systems as they are, as if a level editor were released to the public. Which it hasn't, but if anyone at Creative Assembly wants to be super cool, I would appreciate it very much. I can give you my next Patreon payment. Given these, our design philosophy could be as follows. First, unsurprisingly, create layouts that are centered around ring shapes. Alien Isolation is a stealth game above all else, so having obstacles that block sightlines that can still be circumnavigated is paramount. This should be true at multiple scales. Placing a desk or a table in the middle of a room creates a circular shape around it. Rooms themselves are frequently connected with circular hallways, and some missions as a whole form a giant loop. If you want to add verticality to your maps, and I strongly suggest you do, The game has some examples of toruses on the second floor encircling an area below, creating a kind of bowl shape that I think works excellently. Second, segment levels into discrete areas through the use of choke points. These don't necessarily have to be blocked by a locked door, as the choke point to the area with the examination rooms isn't, but that can certainly be done if you want to slow the player down and force them to look around a particular section. Adding more interconnections is fine, just as long as they can only be unlocked while the player is backtracking, so you can better control what the player sees on the critical path through the area. Related to that, third, use vents in a way that don't undercut your choke points or dead ends. The idea behind them is that they provide an alternative path for the player to circumnavigate obstacles, most likely the alien. Is the xenomorph out in the hall? Use the vent. Is it in the vent? Use the hall. Providing a second path around a locked door, however, makes the locked door kinda useless, and similarly providing a vent in a spoke area makes it not much of a dead end. Fourth, make sure those dead ends have at least one place to hide in. The experience the game is trying to simulate is being hunted by a predator, but narrowly avoiding it, with failure coming as a result of the player making a mistake that makes them more detectable. As such, they need to be given the opportunity to test their skills in each and every area. And lastly, if you're going to design encounters with only human and android enemies, keep the spaces for these encounters really small. Human and Working Joe enemies can work well in conjunction with the xenomorph in those ring-like areas, but they can be run away from when on their own in more open areas, which can make them less threatening and more alienating. Do you get it? Do you get it? It's a joke about capitalism. Alien Isolation, unfortunately, feels like one of those games that just kinda came and went. But given that I've been able to devote a 15-page script to it, I feel confident saying that it has a lot of aspects worth talking about. And it's especially worth a closer look in relation to the horror genre. As much as I like games like Amnesia and Outlast, because of their very directed nature, the experience they provide gets pretty bland on a second run-through. You know where all the scares occur, you know where the patrol paths for the enemies are, and it becomes kind of a facsimile of your first time with the game. But Isolation is fundamentally different because the alien has no patrol route. Every time you attempt to complete a level, it seems to start in a different room or walk down a different hall, providing that much needed unknown factor to making a tense situation. Every time I replayed this game to look at a map or record footage, I felt anxious as shit. And the fact that the game can still provoke that in me after the number of sessions I've had with this thing is really impressive. And what's even more impressive is the way the game bet on this aspect. There's a challenge mode with a number of maps where the player needs to complete randomly located objectives, and they're given a score based on how quickly they can complete them. Creative Assembly said, "We're going to have a game mode where you play the same maps over and over again, and you're not going to get bored with them," and they were right. They pulled off an arcade mode in a horror game. I think this is the video where I've been most critical of the game I'm discussing so far, but it's worth pointing out that the areas I've argued are the least effective are also the areas that are also the safest. Deciding to base an arcade mode around your AI is a risk. Deciding to have 4-5 hour stretches of the game where it's a non-stop threat is a risk. Deciding that the keystone of your game is going to be something that requires 2 dedicated animators and more AI programmers than I'm comfortable thinking about being on a single task is a gargantuan risk. And yet, those are the parts of the game that work flawlessly. That alone, I think, is why this game is worth talking about, and I hope more people give it a chance. Hey guys, just recording a quick update regarding my Patreon, and hopefully this will be the last one because I'm ending it. At the end of my last video, I said that I would end the Patreon if I became more financially stable via a raise or bonus, and that happened for completely different reasons that I speculated it would happen, actually, but it happened. I'm up to $15 an hour now, and Bernie was right. It is way easier to get by on that amount of money, so I'm going to be a man of my word and just close the Patreon down. Plus, honestly, I've always felt kind of weird asking people for money, so I'd feel like a real piece of shit if I didn't follow through on this. A few people decided to pledge money after the last video, but whether or not I ended up charging them, I want to thank them here. It's not just financial support, it's support and encouragement in the form of saying, I believe in your content so much that I'm willing to put money up to back it, which is honestly very moving. So with that, I'd like to thank Daniel Faulkner, Lan Hoot, Denny Chowhord, Parker Anderson, Chris Chapman, Dean Maxim, and Matt MML Lucas, my man MML Commentaries. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Mitch, aka Heavy Eyed, for helping me confirm that the mastering I was putting on my voiceover was not making it sound like a bunch of hot garbage. Although that was for the VO on the Thief video, I just forgot to thank him at the end there. Also, my new apartment has no carpeting, so everything is this reverberant sonic mess, so maybe it's not the best time to associate the quality with you. I'm sorry, Mitch.